In this lesson, we're going to be connecting to the random user API. So this is an API that generates dummy data that you can use, and also it's good practice material for making JSON and getting JSON data and outputting it on the page. So our application is going to be dynamic, where we can select the number of users that we want to return. We hit the click me button, and that results in returning back all of these users. So these are all dummy profiles. And we've added in some features into the application where if we click it, it just puts it here at the top of the page. So whatever user we're selecting, it dumps it to the top of the page. And then you can build your own version. And there's a lot of information that's contained within the API data. And this is all JSON structured data that you can make use of within your web page, and practice selecting the different property values and outputting them onto your page. So let's get started. I've set up the default index.html page. So we've got the four HTML elements here, the H1, the input, the button, and the div, so that we can output data. And we've got some basic content on the page and linking out to app5.js. So that's where we're going to be doing all of our JavaScript construction. So selecting the page elements, kept that into the JavaScript file, also making some updates and adding the event listener. Let's also double check and make sure that our event listener is firing. And when we click the button, we do get ready within the console. So we're ready to make the connection, make the fetch request to return back the results. The API that we're connecting to in this lesson is going to be randomuser.me. So this is a random user generator. It's a free open source API that allows you to generate user data. And it's kind of like lorem ipsum, but it generates people, images, and it generates a fairly rich set of data that you can use, and it's also a great API to practice with. They also have some examples here. So here's the jQuery example, and they give you an example of some of the results that are being returned. So there are quite a bit of information here within the results. So let's get to it and connect to the API. The API address is just /API, and this is going to allow you to load the API content, and it's actually going to be / with a slash at the end. So this is going to be the content that's being returned back, and you can also open it up within the web browser and just ensure that this is JSON data. So looking at the page source, and if there's no HTML, then this is being returned back as JSON data. So we can make our fetch request and return the data directly back as a JSON object, and then use that JSON object within the JavaScript. So let's add the web URL, and the URL is going to be this one. So adding it in as a string value, and then let's make our fetch request to the web URL. And we'll just create a separate function, and I'll call it adder. And let's run that adder function in case we need to make some updates to the web URL. We'll pass the URL value directly within the adder function. And then within the adder function, we're going to first output the data that's being passed in, and this is just going to be the web URL. And we can also call it URL as well. So now when we click the button, we get the path passed into the function. It's ready to move it to the next stage, where we'll make the fetch request to the web URL. And once we successfully connect, it's promise based. So we're running the function and getting a response object being returned back. And with that response object, we're going to return it back using the JSON method. And then the next part, the next chain within the promises, is where we can use the data that's being returned back. So at this point, we can get the data, and this should be in a proper JSON structure. And just to double check, let's output that content into the console. And let's also make sure that we're returning back the response object. So let's try, and we see that we get the results coming back. So we've got results coming back from the API where we've got info It tells us the basic overall info that we requested. We've got page 1, results 1, seed, version, and then the results. And the results are represented within an array format. And we can also increase the number of results that we can return back. So let's make a quick update to the content, and we're going to return back a number of results. So we'll set a default value of 10 results, and input val set attribute, and we're going to set the attribute type to number. So that way within the input we're generating a number, so it's can be moved up and down, and that's the difference between the input types there with the number. And we want to add an append to the web URL if we want to turn back more than just the set number of results. We can add and select to return more results back. So that's with the added parameter. So let's get the value of what we've got from input and whatever the current value is. And also let's update that value. So we'll create the string value where we've got the question mark and results. So we're basically going to concatenate to the web URL. And then whatever the results value is, this is the number of results that we want to return back. So we're going to add those two together, and that should now return back a string result of more items coming back from the endpoint. And we can see the number of results changes depending on what our input is. So we have a flexible number of results that we can return back. So let's output into the output area, and then we'll send this information out to be output onto the page. So output inner HTML, and using the backticks again, I'm going to select some content from the data. So we can do a seed, and whatever the seed value is, and that's sitting within data, info, and seed object. And most of the time you're going to find that you can use the dot notation, but if there are spaces, or if any of the property names have spaces or anything that's not properly formatted to be used in the dot notation, then you can use the bracket notation. So keep that in mind, that you can use whatever one is the most effective one. And results, and this is contained within data, info, and results. So let's see what we got now. So we've got the seed, we've got the results, and you can also pull out whatever other information that you want it to add there. I'll just make it larger and wrap it within H3 tags. So there's our results, and now let's send it over to the maker function. And for the maker function, we're going to use the data, and the content is contained within the results array. So we're just going to send that array straight over into the function, and then loop through the contents of that result. So that's coming in from the JSON, or we could just call it data. And for now, we'll console log out data so that we can check and double check to make sure that we've got the content properly. So we're outputting the array of data. So let's loop through data using for each, and loop through the contents. We can turn back the element, and then within the console output the element content. So let's see what we've got now. And then now it's a matter of selecting from the object the data that you want to output on the page, and then adding it using JavaScript. So let's select the name of the person, and also I'm going to create element maker. So first it will select the type of element, or we can do element type or element tag. So that's going to be the tag, and then the whatever the parent is. So we'll pass in those two properties. And we can also have one for content. We'll just call it contents. So let's create the elements as we loop through. So the element type, it's going to be a div. the parent is going to be output, and then whatever we want for the contents. So in this case, we want to add in some temporary contents, and I'll just give it a variable name of temp, and then whatever we want placed within the element, and we want to use the name object, so get the name, the title, the first and last. So from the element, let's get the name and title, and then also add in the first and last values. So first and then last, and then this is this will reference the content that we want to create. And as we iterate through there, we'll create the element, and using the document, and it saves some time when you can create functions that are going to run blocks of code that you'd have to do multiple times. So let's append, and we want to append it to the output object. So this is going to be an object. So parent append, and then we want to append this newly created element to the parent. And then for the element, and let's do the inner HTML of the element, and that can just be held within the contents variable. So let's see what that looks like. So that gave us a structure that we can output the names to. Let's add some more elements to the page. So if we want to include and have the picture, we can add that as well. So let's select the picture object, and selecting the element maker, and adding in another div, and then the contents of the div, so we'll call it temp2, temp1. And within the contents of this div, we're going to add in an image tag with a source, and the source of the content for the image is going to be coming from the element. And let's look at the data structure. So element, picture, and thumbnail, or large element. Actually, let's do a picture and then large. And let's see what that looks like. So it gave us the option to add the pictures. And we can also, now that we've structured it, it's going to be easier for us to, if we wanted to create a parent element that's going to contain these, we can use the document create element, and we can use the same maker to create the element. So if we want to create a parent div, so the parent is going to be the output object, and the element tag is going to be a div that we want to create, and we're not going to have any contents in it. And if we want, we can then, instead of output, we'll append it to div, and then for the div itself, using class list, and so let's also return the element. So that gives us an option to use the div and add a class of box to it. So let's check our HTML and do an inspect on it. So we've got the parents that are box, they've got the title there, and then the images within it. So let's add some styling to that. So selecting the box, adding in some padding, and let's do a display inline block, and set a width to it, so default width to it. And I'll see what this looks like. So that allows us to have a little bit more styling on the elements. Also, let's apply the box sizing to all of them. And what the box sizing will do is, if you use border box, that allows you to remove out any extra. So a width of 25% will be 25% of the available width, and that will also include the 10 pixels of padding. And then also within the box for images, width of 100%. So that will spread the available width of the image all the way across. Let's also do a text align, and we'll center align the contents of the font. Let's do an update on the font size. And of course you can style this however you feel necessary. I'm going to add in some Google fonts. So just select a Google font to apply a little bit more styling class to it. And actually I'm going to select the regular one. And my preferred is to use import. You can also use the link. So whatever your preference is, because most of the time I am doing this within a style sheet file. So that way I just import it and I don't have to worry about linking to it on the page. But because I am doing it on the page, I could just as easily just link to it on the page. And within the body object, we're going to apply the font family. So that just is going to get applied across the board on the page. So we got the font. And also let's add a little bit more styling to the divs that are immediately underneath it. So doing a border, and just do a slight border around it. And then also maybe a little bit of padding within those as well. So that just adds that type of effect to the content. Let's also output some more content on the page. So we've got the names, and let's see what other information we might want to pull out there. We can also add in the email address as well if we want. So let's do a line break here and select the email. So that one's right on the root of the element. So you can select the email address like this and run through it. And that's a little bit long, so let's resize and overflow. We'll do an overflow hidden. So that way we're not, and that will allow us to resize. And if we want to make it responsive, of course, we could add in the media queries to resize the content. And it looks like this font is throwing an error. So I'm going to just update it and change it to a different font style. So select the different font style. And I'll make this bigger so we can do the selection of that font style. And I'll remove out the other ones that were causing the issue. And let's do an import on this font style. So updating our source for the import for the font style. And then let's also update the body font family. And go back to the application and see how that works. And we also probably want to make the font size smaller, because most of the time we're working on a smaller screen. And then you can adjust this as needed. So when I'm on the smaller screen, that I've got the content showing up. And it looks like the overflow should be on the divs inside, immediately inside the box, so that we don't have the emails that are hanging over the excess. Also, let's take a look at what other values we can get from the object and see what else we might want to update and add to the page. So within each one of these objects, we've got a date of birth as well. So let's add that date of birth. So we've got an age and a date. So going again into the JavaScript, we'll just do a line break there, date of birth, and then add that object details. So that's within the element object and within a property named date of birth. And then we've got the age. So how about we just do an age here. And then try it again. Make sure that you're outputting. So it looks like left out the $sign there. So try that one more time. So we've got the age. And you can tell that this is just sample data, so it doesn't necessarily reflect the contents of the user. And let's do one more where we'll add in the location as another object. So we can add that in maybe under the picture. And now that we've got the element maker, it's going to make it really easy to add additional objects onto the page. So if we want to get the location, it's within the element location. And you can also shorten it. So to make it more readable, if you want, you can get the location object, so element location. And that will shorten the path to that object property. So this way I can do location and select the city. And we'll just try that first and just make sure it's working. So there's the city. And then whatever else we want for location, we can get the country. So the location, and we're just moved where we've got the root of the object content. And also let's include the state as well. And then whatever else you want to include, that's all possible within the API. So that constructs these elements, provides information about where they're located. And let's do one more thing before we conclude, and let's make this element clickable. So div add event listener, and whenever we click on the element, so whenever we click on it, we'll add in an option that we can update the details at the top of the page. So select where we've got the H1 and take the H1 and let's set the inner, and actually just set this up as the text content. And we can still get the text content using the temp object. So you can do these different types of interactions, and actually this should be inner HTML because we are passing in HTML there. So now whenever we click these, we're updating the information here at the top for the user. In addition, for the box hover, let's update the cursor to pointer. So whenever we go on top of them, it's got the pointer, so that's indicating that it can be clicked. And we might also want to just have everything up at the top as well. So now that we've got it within these objects, it's going to be really easy just to add the content in. And just save that and just try it out, make sure it's working. And let's wrap this with a div. So open and close the div, and we'll wrap temp within the div. So that gives us a quick way to access and see the different users that we've generated, and we can select how many we want to generate, and then this will once again update the content. We'll also move the content to the top, so using the window and scroll to method in JavaScript, and this requires an object parameter, and within the object we can specify where we want to scroll to. So if we want to scroll right to the top, we can scroll it right to the top just by specifying the scroll bar location to 0. So let's try it and move down. So that moves it up. And this is good if you've got a lot of results. So if you've gone down all the way to the bottom, you want to be able to see that you've made that selection, you've brought that particular one up right to the top. So there's a number of options here, and there's quite a bit of data that's within this API. So you can create your own version of this application. And I'm also going to do a quick update to the H1. So we'll take H1, style, and set the width set the margin to auto, and you can do this with with styling as well. Text align, and we'll center align the text. So that will just align the content near the top there. And then also let's add in a border. And test out the application just to make sure it's working. So you do occasionally run into these CORS errors and CORS issues. And this is just something that I wanted to note, that if you do come across CORS errors, and this API for the most part will work, and it does throw these CORS errors occasionally when we're trying to make too many requests from the local. So that can happen where if we're making too many local requests, we see the CORS error, the CORS issue. Now there is a way to go around the CORS, and so to avoid that, it's making the request locally. You can use CORS anywhere, and this is an API that enables cross-origin requests to anywhere. And there's more information about it, but essentially what you do is you apply the URL CORS anywhere just before you make the web URL request. So you could do it like this. It looks like we're coming across another issue, and this is because when we're using CORS anywhere, so it's updating where the request is being made from. So this is good if you're connecting locally to a web API that needs to have a website. But in this case, what's happened here is that we're getting too many requests from this base URL. So it's updating the server as it's coming from the CORS anywhere. So there's probably other people that have been using the CORS anywhere to connect to the random user ME, and that's why it's denying the requests. So there is some throttling on there that it does prevent making too many requests, and we have been making a lot of requests with local, so that's likely why we're throwing the errors when we're making the requests. And you'll find that they will go away. Any type of CORS error or CORS issue, this is related to the server, and you can find out more about how CORS Anywhere works, where you can redirect automatically. So it's good for debugging, and it redirects the results in addition to the CORS redirect header, where it starts at 1 and where headers are not accessible by a typical HTTP request API. And there's more information and demo documentation available on these sites. The challenges and the tasks for this lesson are to connect to the random user API, look through the JSON object, return back the data, and then go through the data and output it on your page, and also build an interactive web application that allows the user to interact with the API data and make use of it and interact with the page content as well. And really get an opportunity to familiarize yourself with getting JSON data from endpoints.